My uncle looked at me across the conference table at Hartley and Bowen Law on a Tuesday morning in February and said, "She hasn't been part of this family for years. She's essentially a stranger with a last name." His wife, seated beside him, nodded without looking up from her phone. "It's really just a clerical holdover. Nana probably forgot to update the paperwork." I sat very still. I looked at my hands folded on the table. I counted the wood grain lines on the surface in front of me. I did not say a single word. The estate lawyer, Mr. Bowen, cleared his throat and shuffled the documents in front of him. He glanced at me once, just briefly, and then looked back at my uncle. "Mr. Calloway," he said carefully, "before we proceed, I want to make sure everyone in this room understands who all the named parties are." My uncle waved his hand dismissively. "We know who everyone is, Gerald. Let's just move forward." Mr. Bowen did not move forward. "I want to tell you how I got to that room, because nothing that happened that morning makes sense without understanding what came before it. My grandmother, Dorothy Calloway, was the kind of woman who kept paper records of everything. Utility bills from 1987, Christmas card lists going back 30 years. She had a filing cabinet in her basement, in her house in Oakville, Ontario, and she knew exactly where everything was. She called it responsible living. She said the worst thing a person could do was leave their affairs in disorder for the people who loved them. She raised me to believe the same thing. My mother died when I was 9 years old. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in January, gone by the following October. My father had left when I was 4, not dramatically. Not with a fight, he simply stopped coming home one day and eventually we stopped expecting him. So when my mother got sick, it was my grandmother who drove the 3 hours from Oakville to our apartment in Ottawa, packed up what mattered, and brought me back with her. I grew up in that house in Oakville. I went to school there. I learned to drive in the parking lot of the Sheridan Center on a Sunday morning when there was no one around. I sat at Dorothy's kitchen table every night and did my homework while she watched the news and occasionally shouted corrections at the television. She was not a soft woman. She did not say "I love you" easily or often, but she showed up, every single time she showed up. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, Richard, visited at Christmas and occasionally at Thanksgiving. He had married a woman named Sandra when I was 12, and Sandra was the kind of person who smiled at you with her whole face while saying something that landed like a closed fist. Richard had 2 daughters, my cousins, Britt and Madeline, who were pleasant enough to me in the way that people are pleasant to someone they consider temporary. I was not temporary. But I understood that they thought I was. After high school, I went to the University of Guelph, studied business and finance, and then articled at an accounting firm in Toronto. I passed my CPA exam on the first attempt. I was 24. My grandmother made a roast chicken dinner and a butter cake and invited exactly no one else to celebrate, which was exactly what I wanted. By the time I was 28, I was a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Toronto. By 30, I had been recruited by a larger firm in the financial district. I was not famous. I was not on any lists. I was just very good at my job, and I worked hard and I saved carefully, and I built a life that felt solid in the way that only things you construct yourself ever truly feel. My grandmother knew all of this. We had Sunday phone calls. We had visits every 6 weeks or so. When she was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 2 years ago, I was the one who drove to Oakville and sat with her cardiologist and took notes and asked questions. I was the one who arranged the home care. I was the one who called the pharmacy about her medications and set up the automatic refill schedule and labeled every bottle in large print so she could read them without her glasses. Richard called. Occasionally, he sent a fruit basket at Christmas. My grandmother died on a Thursday morning in November, quietly, in her own bed, which is what she had wanted. I was there. I had driven down the night before because something in her voice on our Sunday call had told me to come. I held her hand. I told her she had been the most reliable person I had ever known, and that I had learned everything important from watching her. She squeezed my fingers once and closed her eyes. I called Richard from the driveway an hour later. His first question, after a brief silence, was, "Did she have a will?" She did have a will. Dorothy Calloway had a will, a living trust, a powers of attorney document, an advance care directive, and a detailed letter of wishes, everything notarized and updated 18 months before she died, filed with Hartley and Bowen, which had been handling her affairs for 20 years. I did not know the details of the will before that February morning. That was deliberate on my part. My grandmother had mentioned, in her careful way, that she had tried to be fair and thoughtful, and I had told her that whatever she decided was her right, and I would respect it. That was the end of the conversation. What I had not known, what Richard had not known either, though his reaction made it clear he had expected a different outcome, was that Dorothy had left the Oakville house and the majority of her estate to me. Richard received a portion, a meaningful one, enough to be significant. But the house, the financial accounts, and what turned out to be a more substantial portfolio than any of us had been aware of those, went to me. The meeting at Hartley and Bowen had been called to go over the estate. I had arrived on time. Richard and Sandra had arrived together, and from the moment they walked in and saw me sitting there already, something shifted in Sandra's face. A tightening. A recalculation. Richard sat down and said hello in a tone that suggested he was doing me a favor by acknowledging me. Sandra placed her handbag on the table and said, "I didn't realize you'd be here." "I'm a named party in the estate," I said. "Right," she said. "Of course." Mr. Bowen came in, arranged his papers, offered coffee, and began the formal process of explaining the document. He was methodical. He read each clause carefully. When he reached the section outlining the primary bequest, the house, the accounts, the portfolio, Richard's expression changed in a way I had seen before on other faces. A kind of slow, incredulous shift, like a man realizing the train he thought he was boarding is actually leaving without him. He let Mr. Bowen finish reading. Then he said, "I want to contest this." Mr. Bowen looked at him over his reading glasses. "That is your legal right," Mr. Bowen said. "However, I should tell you that this document was prepared with considerable care. Your mother was assessed for capacity at the time of signing. There is documentation from her physician, and from myself as a witness. She was being manipulated," Richard said. He said it flatly, like a statement of fact. "She was elderly, and she was being influenced by someone who had positioned herself to take advantage." The room was very quiet. I looked at my hands again. I noticed a small chip in my nail polish on my left index finger. I thought about the drive to Oakville the night my grandmother died. I thought about the pharmacy labels. I thought about sitting beside her cardiologist and writing down the names of 3 different medications, and then going home and researching all of them so I could understand what they were doing and whether they were interacting correctly. Richard turned to look at me for the first time since he'd made the accusation. "You inserted yourself into her life after we were established in ours. You made yourself indispensable. That's not love. That's strategy." Sandra was nodding. I said nothing. Mr. Bowen set down his pen. "Mr. Calloway, I have known your mother for 20 years. I have also observed her relationship with your niece for a significant portion of that time. I want to be very precise here, because you have used the word manipulation, which has legal implications. I'm aware of the implications." "Are you aware, Mr.?" Bowen said. And there was something in his voice that shifted slightly, not unkind, but deliberate, that your niece holds a CPA designation and has been a senior accountant at one of the largest firms in the financial district for the past 3 years? Richard blinked. "Are you aware that she was named this year to her firm's partnership track committee, which, for context, is not a position offered to someone whose judgment or integrity is in question?" Sandra's nodding had stopped. "Are you aware that the investment portfolio your mother left, the one you have been implying she did not understand or could not manage, was restructured 4 years ago, at Dorothy's request, with advice from your niece, and has appreciated by 31% since then?" The room was absolutely silent. Mr. Bowen picked his pen back up. "I ask these questions not to embarrass you, but because the word manipulation implies that someone with inferior standing or ulterior motive took advantage of a vulnerable person. I want to make sure you have a complete picture before you proceed with that characterization." Richard looked at me. His face was different now. The certainty had gone somewhere. I met his eyes and held them. I had spent a long time, years, if I'm honest, thinking about what I would say if I was ever in a room where someone tried to reduce me to a convenience, a hanger-on, a last name with no substance behind it. I had constructed speeches in my head, arguments, evidence. Sitting there, I found I didn't want to say any of them. "Richard," I said quietly, "I did not do any of those things for the house or the money. I did them because she was my grandmother and she raised me, and she was the only consistent person in my entire childhood. I would have done all of it if she'd left everything to you. I would have done it if there was nothing to leave at all." He did not say anything. "You can contest it," I said. "That's your right. But I want you to think very carefully about what you're willing to say under oath about your own involvement in her life during the last 5 years. Because Mr. Bowen has records. And I do too. I had a folder in my bag. I had not been sure whether I would need it. It contained phone logs, visit records, medical appointment dates. The spreadsheet I had built tracking her medications, her symptoms, her cardiologist appointments, her home care hours, and every grocery run I had made to her house since her diagnosis. I had not built it to use as a weapon. I had built it because I was a person who kept records, because my grandmother had taught me that responsible living meant leaving your affairs in order. I set the folder on the table and slid it to the center, without opening it. Richard stared at it. Sandra looked at her hands. Mr. Bowen quietly resumed reading from the document. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Richard did not speak again except to ask 2 procedural questions in a flat, careful voice. When Mr. Bowen concluded and asked if there were any final questions, Richard said no. Sandra gathered her handbag. They left without saying goodbye. I stayed to sign the necessary paperwork. Mr. Bowen shook my hand at the door and said, in his measured, professional way, "Your grandmother was a woman of very clear judgment. I think today demonstrated that." I drove back to Toronto in the late afternoon, through gray February light, past frozen fields along the QEW, and I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table. I thought about her shouting at the news. I thought about the way she had squeezed my hand. I had never needed Richard to see me. I had needed Dorothy to see me, and she had. Completely. That was what the house and the portfolio meant to me. Not the money, not the property, but the fact that she had looked at her life and her choices and decided, with full clarity and full capacity, that I was the person she trusted most. That is not something a stranger receives. That is not something a clerical holdover produces. There's a thing that happens sometimes when you've spent your whole life building something from very little, your security, your competence, your sense of your own worth, and then someone who contributed nothing to that construction looks at it and decides it should belong to them. They rewrite the story. They say you were calculating, strategic, opportunistic. They take the evidence of your love and they reframe it as evidence of your ambition. It took me a long time to understand that this reframing is not actually about you. It is about them. It is about the gap between what they did and what they wish they had done. It is about grief and guilt and the much simpler story it tells to make someone else the villain. I did not hate my uncle. I understood him, which is a different and in some ways more difficult thing. The Oakville house needed work. The back deck had soft spots in the boards. The kitchen needed updating. There was a filing cabinet in the basement full of paper records going back 40 years, and I spent 2 weekends going through it carefully, organizing what mattered and shredding what didn't. At the very back of the bottom drawer, in a folder labeled with my mother's name, I found a photograph I had never seen. My mother at maybe 23, standing in the backyard of that same house in summer, laughing at something outside the frame. She looked so much like me it made my chest ache. I put the photograph on the mantel. My grandmother had kept it all that time. In her careful, organized, responsible way, she had kept every piece of the people she loved right where she could find them. I am the same way now. I keep good records. I show up. I pay attention. She taught me that.